If we lose that document, we're not just losing money, Ethan Callaway said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the glass-walled boardroom. We're losing everything. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that didn't come from respect, but from fear, the kind that sat heavy in the chest and made even the most confident executives avoid eye contact. And outside, 30 floors below, the city moved on without noticing that an empire was quietly standing on the edge of collapse. 10 minutes later, the same man walked into a quiet restaurant on the corner of Lexington Avenue, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit, his watch catching the soft amber light as he checked the time for the third time in under a minute, his mind still buried in projections, contracts, and the single document that could either save his company or destroy it. And he didn't look up when he sat down, didn't notice the way the chair scraped slightly louder than usual against the polished floor, didn't notice the way the room subtly shifted around him the way rooms always did when someone like him entered. Claire Whitman noticed, though she didn't look directly at him, not at first, because she had learned long ago that people like him preferred to be observed without feeling watched. So she moved quietly, placing a glass of water on his table with steady hands, her posture calm, her expression neutral, her presence almost invisible except for the way she seemed to understand exactly how much space to take up and no more. And when he finally spoke, it was without lifting his eyes from his phone. "Black coffee. No sugar," he said, his tone clipped, efficient, the kind of tone that turned requests into expectations. And Claire simply nodded once, not offended, not impressed, just present. And as she turned to leave, the faint clink of something small hitting the floor slipped beneath the hum of conversation, a soft, almost forgettable sound, and no one reacted, not the couple by the window, not the bartender polishing glasses, not even Ethan himself as he stood a moment later to take a call, his chair sliding back, his focus already elsewhere, his voice lowering into the practiced rhythm of someone used to controlling outcomes. And the object lay there, just beneath the edge of the table, half hidden in shadow, a dark leather wallet, still and silent, like it didn't belong to anyone anymore. Claire saw it when she came back with the coffee, her steps slowing just slightly, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for her to register what the rest of the room had missed, and for a moment, she didn't move, didn't reach for it, didn't even bend down. She just stood there, tray in hand, watching the man who had already stepped outside, pacing under the glow of a streetlight, speaking in numbers and deadlines and things that sounded important. And then she looked back at the wallet, at the edge of it catching the light, at the quiet weight it seemed to carry without making a sound, and something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way anyone would point out, just a small stillness, the kind that comes before a decision is made. And she placed the coffee gently on the table, her fingers steady, her breath even, and only then did she crouch down, slow, deliberate, as if the moment itself deserved care, her hand hovering just an inch above the leather before finally closing around it. And when she stood back up, the world continued exactly as it had before. Plates clinked, conversations flowed, the city lights flickered through the windows, and no one noticed that something important had just changed. Not yet. Claire Whitman did not open the wallet right away. She carried it with the same steady balance she used for trays of glassware, as if it were just another object that required care and nothing more. And when she stepped into the quiet hallway near the staff lockers, the noise of the dining room softened into a distant hum, plates clinking like echoes from another world. And only then did she pause, leaning lightly against the cool wall, the leather resting in her hands with a weight that felt heavier than it should. And for a moment she simply looked at it, her thumb brushing over the edge, tracing the fine stitching, noticing how worn it was in some places and perfectly kept in others, like something that had been used often but never carelessly. She exhaled slowly before opening it, not with curiosity, but with intention, and inside, everything was exactly where it should be, crisp bills aligned, cards neatly stacked, a driver license with the name Ethan Callaway staring back at her, his expression just as composed in the photo as it had been at the table, and beneath the cards, tucked carefully, was a folded document, thicker than paper should be, marked with clean, precise lines that suggested importance even before being read. And Claire did not unfold it. She did not need to, because something about the way it was placed told her it mattered. the kind of detail people carried close when they could not afford to lose it. She closed the wallet again, slower this time, her fingers lingering just a second longer than before, and her eyes shifted to the small mirror mounted on the locker door, catching her own reflection. Simple uniform, hair pulled back, nothing remarkable, nothing. That suggested she should be holding something that clearly belonged to a world far beyond hers. And for a brief moment, something flickered across her face, not temptation exactly, but awareness, the quiet calculation of what that amount of cash could do. Rent paid for months, groceries without counting every dollar, a little space to breathe in a life that rarely allowed it. And then just as quickly, the thought passed, not pushed away, not fought, simply acknowledged and released, like a wave that rises and falls without leaving a trace. Out in the dining room, the door opened and closed again, the faint rush of cold air slipping inside, and through the glass, she could see Ethan still pacing, his voice tighter now, sharper, the rhythm of control beginning to fracture at the edges, and she watched him for a second, not with judgment, not with sympathy, just observation. The way she always watched people when they did not know they were being seen, and then she slipped the wallet into her apron pocket, not hiding it, not claiming it, just holding it until the next right step revealed itself. Minutes later, he came back in, faster this time, his movements less measured, his eyes scanning the room with a focus that had nothing to do with menus or meals, and he reached into his jacket pocket, then the other, his hand pausing, his expression tightening in a way that only someone paying attention would catch. And Claire was already moving before he said a word, not rushing, not drawing attention, just crossing the space between them with the same calm precision she had always carried. And when she stopped at his table, she did not speak immediately. She simply placed the wallet down beside his untouched coffee, the leather meeting the wood with a soft, final sound. And for the first time since he had walked into the restaurant, Ethan Calloway looked directly at her. Ethan Calloway did not touch the wallet immediately, his eyes fixed on it as if it had appeared out of nowhere, as if acknowledging it too quickly would make something worse real. And for a second, the entire room seemed to narrow down to that small rectangle of leather sitting beside his untouched coffee, the steam now gone, the surface still, and when he finally reached for it, his movements were slower than before, less certain, his fingers pressing into the edge as though confirming it was real. And when he opened it, the breath he had been holding slipped out quietly, not dramatic, not loud, just enough to release the tension that had been tightening around him since the moment he had stepped back inside. And his eyes moved quickly, scanning, counting without appearing to count, checking without wanting it to be obvious. And everything was there, every card, every bill, every detail exactly where it should be, untouched, unchanged, as if it had never left his possession at all. He looked up then, really looked this time, at Claire Whitman standing across from him, her posture the same, her expression calm, her hands resting lightly at her sides as if she had simply completed another routine task. And there was no expectation in her eyes, no subtle shift in stance that suggested she was waiting for something in return, no hint that she believed this moment should mean more than it already did. And that was what unsettled him most, not the fact that she had returned it, but the way. She had done it without turning it into a transaction. "You found this," he said, his voice lower now, less controlled, as if it had lost some of its usual edge, and she nodded once, simple, direct. "It was on the floor," she replied, her tone even, not defensive, not proud, just factual. And for a moment he said nothing, his gaze shifting briefly back to the wallet before returning to her, as if trying to understand something that did not fit into the patterns he was used to. And then, almost automatically, he reached into the wallet again, pulling out a few bills, the motion quick, practiced, the kind that had solved problems his entire life. And he placed them on the table between them, not dramatically, not carelessly, just as something that should naturally follow what had just happened. And Claire's eyes moved to the money, then back to him, and she did not touch it, not immediately, not even out of hesitation, but out of clarity, as if she already knew what she was going to do, before the moment had fully formed. "That is not necessary," she said quietly, and there was no sharpness in her voice, no challenge, just a gentle refusal that carried more weight than if she had argued. And Ethan paused, his hand still resting near the edge of the table, and used to the idea that something he offered might not be accepted, and used to the idea that value could exist outside of what could be measured or exchanged. And the silence that followed was different from the one in the boardroom earlier, not heavy with pressure, but still in a way that made space for something unfamiliar. And he studied her again, more carefully this time, noticing the small details he had overlooked before, the steadiness in her gaze, the absence of urgency, the quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself. And for the first time that day, Ethan Callaway did not immediately know what to say next. Claire Whitman did not move to take the money, and she did not step back either. She simply stood there, grounded in a quiet certainty that did not need to explain itself. And after a second that felt longer than it should, she reached forward, not for the cash, but for the edge of the table, sliding the bills gently back toward him as if returning something that never belonged to her. And Ethan Callaway watched the motion in silence, his fingers curling slightly as the money came to rest near his hand again, and used, unclaimed, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that happens when a familiar rule suddenly stops working. "You could have kept it," he said, not accusing, not even questioning, just stating a fact that had clearly crossed his mind more than once in the last minute. And Claire tilted her head just slightly, her gaze steady. "It was not mine," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer seemed to land heavier than any explanation could have, because there was no justification attached to it, no story about values or principles, just a quiet line drawn where it needed to be. Outside, a car passed, its headlights briefly sweeping across the window and fading just as quickly, and inside, the rhythm of the restaurant resumed around them. But at their table, time felt slower, more deliberate, as if both of them were standing just slightly outside of it. Ethan glanced down at the wallet again, this time opening it more carefully, his fingers moving with a precision that suggested he was not just checking for money anymore. And when he reached the folded document tucked inside, he paused, his thumb pressing lightly against the paper before pulling it out just enough to confirm what he already feared, and the tension that returned to his shoulders was immediate, sharper this time, because now it was not about what could have been lost, but what had almost been gone without him ever knowing. And he exhaled through his nose, slower, controlled, the way someone does when they are trying to recalibrate without letting it show. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, holding the document just slightly higher, not enough for her to read, but enough to acknowledge its presence. And Claire shook her head once. "No," she said, and there was no curiosity in her voice, no attempt to lean in or ask more, just acceptance of the boundary. And that, more than anything, made him hesitate, because he was used to people leaning closer when something valuable appeared, used to eyes sharpening, voices changing, but hers remained exactly the same, calm, unclaimed, untouched by whatever importance he was assigning to the paper in his hand. He studied her for another moment, longer this time, as if trying to find a reason behind her stillness. And when he did not find one that fit his expectations, he slipped the document back into the wallet, closing it with a quiet snap that sounded final in a way that echoed, louder than it should have. And then he placed the wallet flat against the table, his palm resting on top of it for just a second before pulling away. "You have no idea what you just did," he said, his voice lower now, not distant, not commanding, but grounded in something closer to honesty. And Claire met his gaze without flinching, without leaning into the weight of his words, and after a brief pause, she answered, just as simply as before, "I returned something that was lost." And there it was again, that same steady line, that same refusal to turn the moment into anything more than what it needed to be. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Callaway found himself standing in front of something he could not measure, could not negotiate, could not reduce into numbers or outcomes, something that simply existed, complete on its own, and it left him, unexpectedly, without control. Claire Whitman did not stay to watch his reaction. She gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and turned back toward the dining floor as if the moment had already ended for her, as if returning the wallet had simply closed a loop that did not need to be revisited. And within seconds, she was moving between tables again, refilling glasses, adjusting plates, her rhythm unchanged, her presence blending back into the quiet choreography of the restaurant. Ethan Calloway remained where he was, his hand resting near the wallet. His thoughts no longer aligned with the structured urgency that had filled them earlier, because now there was something else layered into them, something that did not belong to spreadsheets or projections, something quieter, harder to define, and he found himself watching her without meaning to, noticing the way she moved without rushing, the way she listened without leaning in, the way she seemed to exist outside of the constant push for more that governed every room he usually occupied. His phone vibrated against the table, sharp and insistent, and he glanced down at the screen, the name lighting up again. The same call he had stepped outside to take before, the same conversation waiting to be finished. And for a moment, he hesitated, not because the call was unimportant, but because something about picking it up felt like stepping back into a version of himself that had just been quietly interrupted. Still, habit won, and he answered, his voice returning to its usual cadence, controlled, precise. "I have it," he said, not explaining, not elaborating, just enough to shift the conversation back on track. And on the other end, the tension was immediate. Questions layered over each other, timelines, expectations, consequences, all the things that had defined his world just an hour ago. And yet, as he spoke, his eyes drifted again, almost unconsciously, back to Claire, who was now crouched beside an elderly couple's table, adjusting a chair so it sat more comfortably, her movements patient, attentive in a way that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with care. And it struck him then, not all at once, but gradually, like a realization forming in pieces, that she had never once asked what was inside the wallet, never once hinted at its value, never once tried to understand the scale of what she had returned. And somehow, that absence of curiosity felt more significant than any reaction could have been. He ended the call sooner than expected, the words coming to a natural close instead of being forced into one. And when he set the phone down, the silence that followed felt different from before, less heavy, more deliberate, as if it had been chosen rather than imposed. And he picked up the wallet again, this time holding it with a different awareness, not just as an object he had nearly lost, but as something that now carried a moment he could not ignore. Across the room, Claire stood back up, brushing her hands lightly against her apron, and for a brief second, their eyes met again, not by accident this time, but not intentionally either, just a simple crossing of awareness. And there was no question in her gaze, no expectation, no lingering connection that demanded continuation, just a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had happened and was now complete. And as she turned away, returning to her work without pause, Ethan Calloway realized something that did not fit neatly into any of his usual conclusions, something that sat just outside the logic he trusted, that sometimes the most significant things were not the ones that demanded attention, but the ones that passed through quietly, leaving everything different without ever asking to be noticed. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but something in Ethan Calloway did not, and he remained seated longer than he had planned, his coffee untouched, now completely cold, the surface reflecting the soft ceiling lights like a still mirror, and he found himself staring at it without seeing it, his mind replaying a moment that should have been insignificant by his standards, a misplaced wallet, a returned item, a brief exchange, and yet it refused to settle into something simple. He opened the wallet again, more deliberately this time, his fingers moving past the cash and cards until they reached the folded document. And when he pulled it out fully, the weight of it returned in a way that tightened his chest, because this was not just paper, it was months of negotiation, projections, agreements that had not yet been secured in any system, not yet backed up, not yet protected. The only copy he had trusted himself to carry personally, and for the first time since the meeting that morning, the full scope of what could have happened unfolded clearly in his mind, not as a dramatic disaster, but as a quiet unraveling, deals falling apart one by one, investors pulling back, confidence dissolving without a single visible cause. And it all could have started with something as small as a wallet left behind on a restaurant floor. He pressed his thumb lightly against the edge of the paper, as if grounding himself in its presence, and then folded it back carefully, placing it exactly where it had been before, but this time with a precision that carried more intention, more awareness, as if the act of putting it back was also an acknowledgement of how close it had come to being gone. Across the room, Claire Whitman continued her shift, her movements steady, unchanged, and Ethan realized with a quiet clarity that she had walked away from something far larger than she could have known. Not just money, not just a wallet, but a chain of consequences that stretched far beyond that moment. And she had done it without hesitation, without calculation, without even understanding the scale of what she had chosen to return. His phone buzzed again, a message this time, short, direct, asking for confirmation, for updates, for certainty, and he typed a response, slower than usual, his words more measured, not because he did not know what to say, but because something in him was no longer rushing to prove control over every outcome. And when he set the phone down, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting once more toward Claire, who was now standing near the window, speaking softly to a customer, her expression attentive, her posture relaxed, and it struck him then, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet understanding that settled into place, that she had not just returned something he lost. She had preserved something he had not even realized was at risk. He glanced at the money, still resting near his hand, untouched since she had pushed it back, and for a moment, he considered it again, not as payment, not as reward, but as a gesture, something to bridge the gap between what he understood and what she had done. And yet, even that felt insufficient, incomplete, as if trying to translate something simple into a language that did not quite fit, and he closed his hand around the bills, not to offer them again, but to put them away, accepting for the first time that not everything could be returned in the same form it was given. When he stood, the chair moved quietly against the floor, and for a brief second, Claire glanced in his direction, not with expectation, not with curiosity, just a simple acknowledgement of movement, and he hesitated, just slightly, as if considering whether to say something more, something that would capture the weight of what had just happened, but no words came that felt accurate, and so he gave a small nod instead, subtle, almost invisible, and turned toward the door, stepping back into the night air that felt colder now, sharper, as if the world outside had not changed at all, even though something inside him clearly had. The night air outside felt sharper than it had before, the kind that carried the faint hum of the city even when the streets looked calm, and Ethan Calloway stood still for a moment just beyond the restaurant door, his hand resting briefly against the cold metal handle as it closed behind him, the quiet click marking a separation that felt larger than the space he had just crossed, and he glanced down at the wallet again, now back in his pocket, its presence heavier than before, not because of what it contained, but because of what it now represented. Across the street, a taxi idled with its headlights cutting through the dim glow of street lamps, and somewhere in the distance, a siren passed, fading quickly, the city continuing its endless motion without pause, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath visible for a second before disappearing into the night, and then he reached into his jacket, pulling out his phone again. But this time, he did not open his email, did not return to the thread waiting for his approval. Instead, he opened a different contact, one he rarely used directly, and after a brief hesitation, he typed a short message, precise as always, but carrying a different kind of intent, one that was not driven by urgency, but by something quieter, more deliberate. Inside, Claire Whitman moved through the final stretch of her shift, the pace slowing as tables cleared, chairs shifting back into place, the low murmur of conversations thinning into scattered voices. And she wiped down a surface near the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, layered over the blurred lights outside. And for a moment, she paused, not because she was tired, but because the stillness allowed it, her hands resting lightly against the table as she looked out without really focusing on anything specific. And then, just as naturally, she returned to her work, stacking menus, aligning them neatly, her movements consistent, unbroken, as if nothing about the evening had been out of the ordinary. Back outside, Ethan began walking, his steps measured, not rushed, his mind no longer cycling through projections or risks, but instead replaying something far simpler, a hand placing a wallet on a table, a voice saying it was not necessary, a refusal that had not been resistance, but clarity. And the more he turned it over, the more he realized that the moment did not fit into any category he was used to. It was not a negotiation, not a favor, not even an act that demanded acknowledgement. It simply existed, complete on its own, and that was what made it impossible to ignore. His phone buzzed again, the reply arriving faster than expected, and he glanced at the screen briefly. Reading the confirmation, the next steps already set in motion, and he slipped the phone back into his pocket without responding further, trusting that this time, the process did not need his constant oversight. Minutes later, a black car pulled up to the curb beside him, the door opening smoothly, and he stepped inside without hesitation, the warmth replacing the chill of the street, the interior quiet, insulated from the outside world. And as the car moved forward, merging back into the flow of traffic, Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the passing lights, each one stretching and fading in the glass. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to sit without reaching for something to control, without trying to direct the next outcome, just letting the motion carry him forward. Inside the restaurant, Claire finished her shift, untied her apron, folding it neatly before placing it in her locker, her routine unchanged, her expression calm, and as she stepped out into the same night air, the cold meeting her just as it had met him earlier, she pulled her coat closer around her, not thinking about the wallet, not replaying the moment, because for her it had already passed, already settled into the simple category it belonged to, something found, something returned, nothing more. And as she walked down the sidewalk, her steps light, steady, the city lights reflecting softly in her path, there was no sign that the quiet choice she had made would continue moving long after she had let it go. Morning arrived without ceremony, the city shifting from shadow to light in a gradual wash of pale gold across glass and steel, and inside a high-rise office overlooking Manhattan, Ethan Callaway stood by the window with the same wallet resting on his desk, unopened since the night before, as if its presence alone was enough to remind him of something he was still trying to fully understand. And behind him, the boardroom filled slowly, executives taking their seats, voices low, measured, carrying the familiar tone of anticipation mixed with unease, because they all knew what was at stake even if they did not say it aloud. Ethan turned at last, picking up the wallet with deliberate care, removing the folded document and placing it at the center of the table, the paper lying flat, uncreased, intact, and for a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not know what it was, but because they recognized what it represented, the difference between forward motion and collapse. And one of the executives leaned slightly forward, his voice cautious. "We thought it was lost," he said, and Ethan met his gaze briefly before responding. It almost was, and that was all he offered. No explanation, no elaboration, just a quiet acknowledgement that carried more weight than a detailed account ever could. The meeting moved forward from there, but not in the way it had been expected. The tension that had defined it the day before was gone, replaced by something steadier, more grounded, as decisions were made with clarity instead of urgency, and Ethan found himself listening more than speaking, allowing space between responses, noticing details he might have overlooked before. And when the final agreement was confirmed, when the signatures were placed and the outcome secured, there was a moment of release in the room, a subtle shift from restraint to relief. But Ethan did not react the way he usually would. There was no immediate call, no quick transition to the next objective, just a brief stillness as he looked down at the document one last time before sliding it back into its folder. Later, when the room had emptied and the city noise filtered faintly through the glass, he returned to his desk, the wallet still there, and he picked it up again, turning it over once in his hands, the leather catching the light in a way that felt almost unfamiliar now, and without hesitation, he reached for his phone, opening the contact he had messaged the night before, and this time, his instructions were clearer, more specific, not driven by curiosity alone, but by intention, and as he spoke, his tone remained calm, measured, but there was something new beneath it, something that suggested this was not just another task to be completed, but something that mattered in a way he could not fully quantify yet. Across the city, Claire Whitman stepped out of a subway station, the morning air cooler than she expected, her coat pulled close as she moved with the steady rhythm of someone used to early hours, and she stopped briefly at a corner, waiting for the light to change, her gaze drifting across the street where a small bakery window glowed softly. The scent of fresh bread carried faintly through the air, and for a moment, she allowed herself to pause, not in thought, not in reflection, just in presence, before continuing on, her steps unhurried, her path unchanged, and there was no sign, not in her expression, not in her movement, that anything from the night before had followed her into this new day, because for her, it had already settled into its place, complete, finished, without expectation of return. Back in his office, Ethan ended the call, setting the phone down with a quiet finality. And he looked once more at the empty space on his desk where the wallet had been, now returned to his pocket, and something in that absence felt different, not lacking, but defined, as if the space itself carried a memory that could not be reduced to a simple transaction. And as he turned back toward the window, the city stretching endlessly beyond it, he realized that whatever had shifted the night before had not stayed there. It had followed him here, into decisions, into silence, into the way he now chose to see what mattered. And for the first time in a long time, that change did not feel like something to control, but something to understand. The request he made did not stay contained within a single phone call. It moved quietly through channels that rarely questioned intent, and by mid-afternoon, a name had surfaced, simple, unremarkable on paper, Claire Whitman, no titles attached, no notable affiliations, just a line in a system that did not reflect the weight of what she had done, and Ethan Calloway stared at the information longer than necessary. Not because it was complex, but because it was not, because there was nothing in it that explained the steadiness he had seen, nothing that justified the absence of hesitation, and that absence, more than anything, continued to draw his attention. Across the city, Claire moved through another shift, the hours blending into each other with the same quiet consistency. Orders taken, plates delivered, small exchanges that began and ended without leaving any mark. And if there was anything different about the day, it did not show in her posture, did not alter the rhythm of her steps, because for her, nothing required adjustment, nothing demanded reflection. The choice she had made had already settled into its place, complete and closed. Back in the office, Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, the file still open in front of him, and he tapped once against the desk, a small, controlled motion that carried the edge of a decision forming. And then he reached for his phone again, not to delegate this time, not to pass the task along, but to handle it directly. And when the call connected, his tone was measured, but there was a clarity in it that had not been there before. "I need a reservation," he said, pausing just long enough to consider the words that followed. "The same place as last night." And when the confirmation came, he ended the call without adding anything further, because for once, the reason behind the action did not need to be explained to anyone else. Evening settled again with the same quiet transition, lights reflecting against glass, the city softening without ever truly slowing. And inside the restaurant, Claire adjusted a table setting near the window, aligning utensils with the same precision she gave to everything else, her movements unhurried, her focus complete. And when the door opened, the faint rush of air carried in the presence of someone she had already served once before, though she did not look up immediately, not out of indifference, but out of habit, because attention in her world was always earned by the moment, not assumed by the person. Ethan stepped inside with a different pace this time, less driven by urgency, more grounded in intention, and as he approached the same table, the familiarity of it felt less like repetition and more like continuation, as if something left unfinished had quietly drawn him back. And when Claire finally looked up, their eyes met again, not with surprise, not with recognition that demanded reaction, just a simple awareness that this was not entirely unexpected, and he paused for a second, just enough to let the moment settle, before speaking, his voice steady, but no longer distant. "I believe I owe you more than a thank you," he said, and unlike the night before, he did not reach for his wallet, did not place anything on the table, because this time, he already knew that whatever needed to be said could not be measured that way. And, for the first time since he had walked into that restaurant the night before, the conversation that followed was not about what had been lost or returned, but about something that had quietly begun instead. Claire Whitman did not react immediately to his words, not because she had not heard them, but because she did not rush to respond to things that sounded larger than the moment required. and she simply placed a glass of water on the table in front of him with the same steady precision as before, the soft clink grounding the space between them, and only then did she meet his gaze fully, her expression calm, unchanged, as if whatever he believed he owed her had already been resolved in her mind. The night before. "You do not owe me anything," she said, her voice even, not dismissive, not defensive, just clear, and Ethan Calloway paused, not because he disagreed, but because the certainty in her tone left no room for negotiation, and for a second, he allowed that to settle, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, not reaching for anything, not attempting to redirect the moment into something more familiar. "You returned something that mattered," he said after a brief silence, choosing his words more carefully this time, not as a statement of value, but as an acknowledgement of consequence, and Claire tilted her head slightly, considering the phrasing without changing her stance. "It mattered to you," she replied, and there was something in the distinction she made that shifted the weight of the conversation, moving it away from scale, away from importance defined by numbers or outcomes, and back towards something simpler, more grounded. Ethan exhaled quietly, a small release of tension that did not come from frustration, but from recognition, and he glanced briefly around the room, as if reminding himself where he was, the low murmur of conversations, the soft glow of lights, the steady rhythm that had remained unchanged even as his perspective had shifted, and when his eyes returned to her, there was less distance in them, less of the measured control he usually carried into every interaction. "Then let me ask you something," he said, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, and Claire gave a small nod, signaling that she was listening without needing anything more. "Why did you not keep it?" he continued, his tone quiet, not probing, just seeking clarity. And for a moment, she did not answer right away, not because the question was difficult, but because she did not feel the need to respond faster than necessary, and when she did speak, her voice carried the same steady simplicity as before. "Because it was not mine," she said again, repeating the same line, unchanged, and Ethan watched her closely, waiting for something more, an explanation, a deeper reasoning, but none came, and that absence, once again, carried more meaning than any elaboration could have. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze lowering for a brief moment as if tracing the edges of a thought he had not yet fully formed, and when he looked up again, there was a subtle shift in his expression, something softer, less guarded. "Most people would have made a different choice," he said, not as an accusation, but as an observation shaped by experience, and Claire's lips curved just slightly. Not quite a smile, just the hint of one. "Most people are not standing in my shoes," she replied, and there was no judgment in her tone, no sense of superiority, just a quiet acknowledgement that circumstances did not define decisions as much as people believed they did. The conversation paused there, not awkward, not incomplete, just still, and for the first time, Ethan did not feel the need to fill it, did not reach for the next question or the next point. He simply sat with it, allowing the moment to exist without directing it, and in that stillness, something shifted again, not dramatically, not in a way that could be easily named, but in a way that made the space between them feel less like a transaction and more like an understanding that did not need to be explained. The silence between them did not feel empty. It felt complete, like a thought that had reached its natural end without needing to be extended, and Claire Whitman shifted her weight slightly, her attention returning to the rhythm of the room without breaking the connection entirely. Because for her, conversations were not meant to linger beyond their purpose. They simply moved when it was time to move. Ethan Calloway watched her for a moment longer, not searching for something new this time, but trying to understand what had already been said, and more importantly, what had not. And it occurred to him that her answers had never tried to impress him, never tried to position her in a certain way. They had simply been true, and that kind of clarity was something he rarely encountered in rooms where every word carried an intention beneath it. "What do you want?" he asked suddenly, the question leaving him before he had fully shaped it, and Claire paused, not surprised, but thoughtful, her gaze steady as she considered the meaning behind it. "Right now," she said, her tone calm. "I want to finish my shift," and there was no humor in it, no attempt to soften the response, just a direct alignment with the present moment. and Ethan let out a quiet breath, something close to a small laugh, but without sound, because once again, she had answered in a way that bypassed everything he had expected. He nodded once, acknowledging the simplicity of it, and for a second, he looked down at his hands, resting loosely on the table, as if resetting the direction of the conversation. And when he looked back up, there was a different kind of focus in his expression, not transactional, not strategic, but intentional in a quieter way. "When your shift ends," he said, choosing each word with care, "I would like to continue this conversation somewhere outside of here." And Claire studied him for a moment, not evaluating his status, not weighing what he could offer, but observing the tone, the shift, the absence of pressure behind the invitation, and she did not answer immediately, not because she was uncertain, but because she did not rush decisions that extended beyond the moment. The restaurant moved around them, a server passing by with a tray, a chair being pulled back, the low hum of voices rising and falling, and in the middle of it, their stillness remained intact, unforced, unbroken. And finally, Claire gave a small nod. "After my shift," she said. And that was all, no conditions, no expectations, just an agreement placed as simply as everything else she had said. Ethan did not press further, did not ask for details or confirm anything beyond that. He simply accepted it with a quiet acknowledgement, leaning back slightly, as if giving the moment space to settle into its new form. And for the first time since he had returned, there was no urgency attached to what came next, no need to control the outcome before it happened. Claire turned. Then, stepping back into her role without hesitation, her attention shifting to the next table, the next request, her movements as steady as ever. And yet, something subtle had changed, not in her posture, not in her pace, but in the awareness that the moment they had shared was not finished. It had simply moved forward. Ethan remained at the table, his gaze following her for a brief second before settling elsewhere, not because he was distracted, but because he understood now that attention did not need to be constant to be meaningful. And as he reached for the coffee that had long since cooled, taking a small sip without reacting to the temperature, he realized that for once, he was not measuring the value of what was happening. He was simply allowing it to unfold, one quiet moment at a time. The final tables began to clear as the night settled into its quieter hours, the sharp energy of dinner service softening into a slower, more deliberate rhythm, and Claire Whitman moved through the last of her responsibilities with the same steady focus she had carried all evening, stacking plates, aligning chairs, wiping down surfaces until they reflected the warm overhead lights in clean, quiet lines, and across the room. Ethan Calloway remained where he had been, no longer watching every movement, no longer analyzing each moment, but simply present, allowing the time to pass without trying to shape it. When Claire finally stepped away from the last table, she untied her apron with practiced ease, folding it carefully before placing it in the small locker behind the service door, her motions unhurried, unbroken, as if each action was part of a routine that required no thought. And when she returned, she had traded the uniform for a simple coat, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, the same quiet presence now carried outside of her role. Ethan stood as she approached, not out of obligation, not out of formality, but because something in him recognized the shift, the transition from a space defined by service to one defined by choice. And for a brief second, they faced each other without speaking, the noise of the restaurant fading behind them, replaced by the softer sounds of the street beyond the door, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional echo of footsteps passing by. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice steady, not pressing, just offering the next step, and Claire gave a small nod, the same kind she had given throughout the evening, simple, clear, without hesitation, and together, they stepped outside, the cool air meeting them immediately, sharper now that the night had deepened, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement in long, stretched lines that shifted with every passing car. For a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence itself felt natural, unforced, and they began walking without deciding on a direction, their pace aligned without needing to be set, and after a few steps, Ethan glanced toward her, not with the curiosity he had felt before, but with a quieter awareness. "That document," he said, breaking the silence carefully. It would have cost more than just money if it was lost. And Claire listened without interrupting, her gaze forward, her attention steady, and when he continued, his voice carried a tone that was less about explanation and more about acknowledgement. It would have affected people who had nothing to do with me, people who would never know why things changed. And he paused there, not expecting a response, just letting the words settle into the space between them. Claire considered this for a moment, her steps slowing slightly before returning to their original pace. And when she spoke, her voice remained as calm as it had been all night. "Then it is good that it was returned," she said, and there was no emphasis, no weight added to the statement. Just a simple conclusion that did not attempt to carry the burden he had placed on it. And Ethan looked at her again, something in her response cutting through the layers he had built around the situation, reducing it back to its simplest form. And for a brief second, he smiled, not broadly, not noticeably, just enough to soften the line of his expression. They continued walking, the city unfolding around them in quiet motion. And as the distance from the restaurant grew, the space between what had happened and what it meant became clearer, not through explanation, not through analysis, but through the steady presence of two people who had chosen to meet it without turning it into anything more than it needed to be. And in that quiet, something settled, not finished, but understood in a way that did not require words. The city grew quieter as they walked, not silent, but softened, the sharp edges of the day fading into a steady hum that no longer demanded attention. And under the glow of streetlights, Ethan Calloway slowed his pace slightly, not because he needed to, but because for the first time in a long time, he was not in a hurry to arrive anywhere else. And beside him, Claire Whitman moved with the same calm rhythm she always had, her presence unchanged by everything that had unfolded, as if the world had shifted around her without ever pulling her off balance. They reached a small corner where the street opened into a quiet park, the trees lining the sidewalk casting long shadows that swayed gently with the night breeze. And Ethan stopped there, turning slightly toward her, not to interrupt the moment, but to mark it, to acknowledge that something had come to a natural close. "I spent years thinking everything important had a value," he said, his voice lower now, not weighed down, but clear, in a way that did not need to prove itself, that if something mattered, it could be measured, protected, negotiated. And he paused briefly, his gaze shifting toward the lights in the distance before returning to her. "But last night, you returned something that could not be replaced, and you did it like it was nothing." And Claire met his words without changing her expression, her eyes steady, not dismissing what he said, but not absorbing it as something that needed to redefine her either. "It was not nothing," she replied quietly, and for a second, he waited, expecting more, but she simply continued, "It was just the right thing." And there it was again, that same quiet line, not elevated, not dramatic, just placed exactly where it belonged. And something in Ethan settled in a way he had not expected, not like a revelation, but like a truth that had always been there, waiting to be seen without being complicated. He nodded slowly, not as agreement alone, but as acceptance, and, after a moment, he reached into his jacket, not for money, not for anything that could be exchanged, but for a simple business card, holding it for a second before offering it to her. "If you ever need anything," he said, his tone steady, without expectation, "call me." And Claire looked at the card, then back at him, and she took it, not because she needed it, not because she planned to use it, but because in that moment, it felt appropriate to accept what was being given without turning it into something more. They stood there for another second, the quiet between them no longer carrying questions, no longer searching for meaning, just existing, complete. And then Claire gave a small nod, the same one she had given at the beginning of it all, and turned to continue down the sidewalk, her steps light, steady, her figure gradually blending into the rhythm of the city. And Ethan remained where he was, watching her go, not with regret, not with hesitation, but with a kind of clarity that did not need to hold on to the moment to understand its impact. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets, the night air brushing lightly against his face. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something that did not come from control or success or outcome, but from something far simpler, something that could not be earned or calculated, only recognized when it appeared. And as he turned back toward the city, the lights stretching endlessly ahead, He carried that understanding with him, not as a lesson to apply, but as a standard that had quietly been raised, because sometimes the most powerful change does not come from what we gain, but from what we choose not to take. And if this story stayed with you, even for a moment, then maybe you already understand something that cannot be measured. So feel free to share what it made you think or feel, and stay with us for more stories where the quietest choices carry the deepest meaning.